There's a version of every narcissist that almost nobody ever gets to witness. Not the charming public performance, not even the private cruelty directed at the people closest to him, but something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. What he actually does when there's genuinely no one left to perform for. Today we're walking through 6 specific things that tend to characterize this hidden, unwitnessed version, and understanding them matters because it reveals something important about the actual architecture underneath the confident exterior most people only ever see from the outside. The first thing, a kind of restless inability to simply sit still with nothing demanding his attention. This is worth understanding as more than simple boredom because the quality of restlessness we're describing here operates differently from ordinary discomfort with idle time. Most people can tolerate genuine stillness, a quiet evening with no plans, no phone notifications, no external stimulation, without it producing significant distress. For many narcissists, this kind of unstructured solitude tends to feel genuinely intolerable, and it's worth understanding why. We've discussed throughout this series how a narcissist's sense of self is regulated externally, dependent on continuous input to remain coherent. Alone with nothing to provide that input, something close to a mild identity crisis can begin to surface. Not dramatic, not consciously named as such, but present as a persistent, uncomfortable restlessness that compels him toward his phone, toward background noise, toward almost any available distraction, rather than sitting with the discomfort of simply existing without an audience. The second thing, rehearsing or replaying past conversations, often revising them internally to versions where he comes out looking better. This is worth understanding as a specific observable pattern that sometimes becomes visible even to people who only witness fragments of it. A tendency to revisit past conflicts, past criticisms, past moments where he didn't come across the way he wanted to, running through alternate versions in his mind where his response was sharper, more devastating, more clearly victorious than what actually happened in the moment. This isn't simple daydreaming. It reflects something more specific, an ongoing, largely unconscious project of narrative maintenance, constantly revising the internal story to protect against the discomfort of having actually lost an exchange, actually been caught in a lie, actually been seen clearly in a moment he'd rather have controlled. The third thing, checking repeatedly and sometimes compulsively how he's being perceived by people who currently have no reason to be thinking about him at all. This might look like repeatedly checking social media for reactions to something he's posted, refreshing to see who's viewed his profile, or obsessively monitoring how a specific post or comment is being received, well beyond what ordinary social media use would typically involve. This pattern reflects the same underlying mechanism we've discussed throughout this entire series. A need for continuous external confirmation that he still matters, still commands attention, still holds the significance his fragile sense of self depends on believing he has. Alone, disconnected from any actual real-time source of that confirmation, this checking behavior often intensifies rather than settling because the absence of live input makes the underlying hunger for it more acute rather than less. The fourth thing, a private irritability that has no obvious external trigger. This is worth understanding specifically because of how it differs from anger directed at an actual identifiable source. When alone, some narcissists experience a kind of low-grade, generalized irritation that doesn't seem to be about anything specific. No argument, no clear frustration, simply an uncomfortable, edgy quality to being alone with his own thoughts. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier video about buried, unprocessed shame. Irritability without an obvious external cause often reflects exactly this kind of internal material pressing against the surface without ever being consciously identified or examined. producing discomfort that gets experienced as generalized crankiness rather than being traced back to its actual deeper source. Searched memory. Searched memory. Let me continue with the remaining two things. The fifth thing, compulsive comparison to other people, particularly people who seem to be succeeding in areas where he feels uncertain. Alone without anyone to perform confidence for, comparison tends to surface more nakedly than it does in social settings, where it's usually disguised as casual observation or masked entirely. This might look like extended time spent looking at an ex's new relationship, a former friend's career progress, or a rival's public success, accompanied by genuine private distress that rarely gets acknowledged out loud. This reflects the externally anchored self-worth we've discussed throughout this series. Without a stable internal measure of his own value, his sense of where he stands tends to be calculated constantly against other people, and alone with no performance required, this calculation often becomes more obsessive and more painful than anyone around him would ever guess from his usual confident public presentation. The sixth thing, brief, unguarded moments of genuine sadness or emptiness that get quickly suppressed the moment they're noticed. This is worth understanding as the closest thing to authentic emotional experience many narcissists ever access, and it's precisely why it gets suppressed so quickly once it surfaces. Alone, without an audience to manage or a narrative to maintain, something closer to genuine grief sometimes flickers through. Not dramatic, not sustained, but real, connected to the buried shame and foundational wound we've discussed in earlier videos throughout this series. The suppression that follows almost immediately isn't necessarily conscious avoidance. It's simply the defensive structure doing exactly what it was built to do, redirecting attention away from this uncomfortable material before it can be examined long enough to actually mean anything. Now let's understand what connects all six of these things, because taken individually, they might seem like a scattered collection of minor quirks. Understood together, they reveal something much more significant about the actual architecture underneath the confident, controlled version of a narcissist that most people only ever encounter. Here's the thread running through all six. Every single one of them reflects what happens when the external validation system a narcissist depends on to maintain a coherent sense of self simply isn't available. This is worth understanding as the core mechanism, because it explains why these six patterns cluster specifically in solitude rather than appearing consistently across every context. In social settings, even difficult ones, there's usually some form of external input available, an audience to perform for, a narrative to maintain in front of witnesses, some source of reaction, even negative reaction, to draw from. Alone, all of that disappears, and what's left is a psychological structure that was never actually built to function without it. This is worth understanding through a specific comparison that clarifies the mechanism. Imagine a building that's structurally sound as long as it's continuously receiving external support from scaffolding surrounding it, but that was never actually engineered to bear its own weight independently. As long as the scaffolding remains in place, the building looks stable, functional, indistinguishable from a structure that doesn't need any external support at all. Remove the scaffolding, even temporarily, and the building's actual underlying instability becomes visible, not through collapse necessarily, but through visible strain, visible stress patterns, small signs that something essential is genuinely structurally missing. A narcissist's psychology alone functions similarly. The confident, controlled exterior most people witness is the scaffolding-supported version. What we've described in these six patterns is what becomes visible once that external scaffolding, even briefly, isn't present. Here's what's worth understanding about why this matters, beyond simple curiosity about what happens behind closed doors. These six patterns reveal something important about the actual, ongoing psychological cost of maintaining narcissistic defenses, a cost that gets paid continuously in private, regardless of how successful and effortless the public performance appears from the outside. The restlessness, the narrative revision, the compulsive checking, the unexplained irritability, the painful comparison, the suppressed flickers of genuine sadness, none of this is comfortable to experience, even for the person experiencing it. This is worth understanding clearly, because it complicates a common assumption people sometimes carry after being hurt by a narcissist. The assumption that his confident exterior reflects genuine, comfortable stability, that he's simply gotten away with everything and moved on effortlessly while you were the only one left carrying real weight. The honest picture, based on what actually tends to happen in solitude, is considerably more complicated than that. His public confidence is real, in the sense that it's genuinely, skillfully performed and often quite effective, but it isn't free. It's purchased continuously through exactly the kind of external validation seeking we've discussed throughout this entire series, and the moments when that validation isn't available. Precisely the moments of genuine solitude we're describing today reveal a considerably less comfortable, less stable internal experience than the public performance would ever suggest. Here's something worth understanding, specifically about why this pattern tends to intensify rather than diminish as narcissists age, which connects to something we discussed in an earlier video about the accumulating costs of this psychology over long timelines. As the sources of external validation that once came easily, new relationships, new admirers, new professional opportunities, become harder to access with the same reliability, the specific discomfort of solitude tends to become more acute rather than less, because there's less external scaffolding available overall to distract from or compensate for what solitude reveals. This is worth understanding as part of the broader pattern of accumulating cost we discussed in that earlier video, made specifically visible here through the lens of what happens when he's genuinely, completely alone. Let's bring this together into what actually matters for you, because understanding these 6 hidden patterns is only useful to the extent that it changes something meaningful about how you carry forward whatever relationship you have or once had with someone exhibiting them. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. None of what we've described today constitutes evidence that he's secretly suffering enough to eventually change, or that this internal discomfort will naturally, inevitably lead somewhere productive if given enough time. This is worth stating directly, because it would be easy to interpret these 6 patterns as promising signs, evidence that underneath the confident exterior, there's genuine distress that might eventually motivate real self-examination and real change. We've discussed throughout this series why this hope, however understandable, usually doesn't pan out the way people wish it would. The discomfort we've described today is real, but it's precisely the kind of discomfort his entire defensive structure exists to manage and suppress. Not the kind that naturally produces insight without significant, sustained, deliberate intervention that most narcissists never actually seek out or engage with honestly. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it connects to something we've emphasized repeatedly throughout this entire series. This knowledge isn't meant to give you something new to hope for or wait on. If you find yourself, after learning about these 6 patterns, imagining him alone, restless, uncomfortable in his own solitude, and feeling a flicker of something like vindication or even hope that this discomfort will eventually produce real change, I want you to notice that flicker honestly, without either suppressing it or letting it become a new project you're quietly, unconsciously investing in. This information exists to answer a specific question, the same way similar frameworks throughout this series have existed to answer specific questions. Does anything real happen underneath the confident performance, or is it genuinely completely comfortable and free of consequence the entire way through? The honest answer, based on the mechanisms we've described today, is that something real does happen underneath it. genuine discomfort, genuine restlessness, genuine, if brief and quickly suppressed, flickers of authentic feeling. This should be enough to settle the underlying question. It shouldn't become a reason to keep watching, keep wondering, keep imagining his solitude in detail, as though witnessing it even in your imagination is something you need in order to feel your own experience was valid. Here's the third thing worth understanding as we close out this discussion, and it's perhaps the most important reframe available. Your own healing and your own peace were never actually contingent on knowing what happens when he's alone. This is worth stating plainly because everything we've walked through today, however genuinely revealing, describes an experience that happens in a room you don't have access to, on a timeline that has nothing to do with your own life, producing outcomes that may never resolve into anything you'll ever witness or receive confirmation of. Understanding these 6 patterns can offer a certain kind of intellectual completeness, filling in a piece of the picture you might have wondered about, without that completeness needing to become anything more significant than exactly that. If you're currently in the process of building your own life forward, away from someone who exhibits these 6 patterns, or trying to make sense of a relationship that already ended with someone like this, I want you to take from this discussion exactly what it was designed to offer: a clearer, more complete understanding of the actual architecture underneath the confident performance you once found so convincing, and perhaps still find somewhat disorienting to have seen through as clearly as you eventually did. This understanding is valuable on its own terms. It doesn't require anything further from you. No continued monitoring, no hope for eventual transformation, no need to imagine his solitude in detail as evidence supporting some story about justice eventually arriving. What actually matters, more than any specific detail about his private, unwitnessed restlessness or suppressed sadness, is the life you're building in your own solitude, which, unlike his, doesn't require constant external scaffolding to remain stable because you've done the genuine difficult work throughout this healing process of building something that holds on its own, quietly and completely, whether anyone is watching or not. That's the actual difference worth understanding here, more significant than any of the 6 things we've discussed today. His solitude reveals instability because his stability was never real to begin with, built entirely on external input rather than anything genuinely his own. Your solitude increasingly reveals the opposite: a peace that doesn't require an audience, doesn't require validation, and doesn't quietly fall apart the moment no one else is in the room to witness it holding. That's what you were actually building this entire time, across every video in this series, not something to perform, something real enough to simply exist quietly, entirely on its own,